behalf of the East Wall History Group and Dublin Port Company, I'd just like to welcome everybody to tonight's talk. Dublin Port Company and the East Wall History Group are proud to present this online lecture series, which marks the centenary of the battle that took place at the London and North Western Railway on the 11th of April 1921. Now, 100 years ago, the country was in turmoil with the War of Independence was continuing. Dublin itself was a centre of military activity, and this would have affected the port area as well. As part of this series of talks, we've had a talk which looked at the importation of weapons into the country for use by the revolutionary forces. And we've had a talk on the activity of the IRA in the South Docks. Coming up in the coming weeks, right up to the 20th of May, we have a talk on the activity of the revolutionary movement in the North Docks and a look at IRA casualties in Dublin during the War of Independence. And tonight, halfway through the series of talks, we have Lar Joye, who's going to talk on the subject, Murder by the Throat, Crown Forces in Dublin, 1919 to 1921. So, just for people who don't know who Lar is, I'm going to give a rough resume here, and I'm not going to go through all his achievements, or there'd be no time for the talk. But Lar is currently the Port Heritage Director at Dublin Port since 2017, and he is responsible for the Port Archive that covers 300 years of Dublin history. Working with his colleague Jim Kelleher, he is involved in a number of exciting heritage and greenway projects within the Port Estate. Now, previously, he has curated the award-winning Soldiers and Chiefs, the Irish Soldier at Home and Abroad from 1550 exhibit at the National Museum in Collins Barracks, and it's excellent if you've never seen it. He played a key role in the decade of commemorations 2012 to 2017, involved in a variety of TV documentaries, conferences and projects, including 1913 Lockout, Impact and Aftermath, and Banners Unfurled exhibitions, and the World War I exhibition, Recovered Voices, 1914 to 1916, and War in the Mud, the Irish Soldier on the Western Front. Not content with that, he also represented the National Museum on the Irish Battlefield Commission, the Moore Street Project, GPO Witness History Museum, and was the historical advisor for An Post's 1916 commemorative stamp series. And most recently, he has partnered with the theatre company, a new productions on the plays Pals, the Irish at Gallipoli, Sunder, and These Rooms, and is a member of the Irish Film Institute's newsreel project, the Irish Independence Films Collection. So a lot of experience under his belt, and without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Lar and just say at the end, there will be a chance for discussion, questions and answers. If you have any questions, pop them into the chat function. And now we have Lar Joye with Murder by the Throat, British Crown Forces, 1919 to 1921.
Joe, thank you very much for the introduction. Folks, thank you very much for coming tonight. What I'm going to talk about is the Crown Forces. First of all, though, I'm going to look at the IRA very, very quickly to kind of contextualize it. But then we're going to look at who were the Crown Forces, which consisted of the British Army, the Royal Irish Constabulary, Dublin Metropolitan Police, the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, the Coast Guard and the RAF, but I'm going to focus mainly those on land. I'm not going to talk about the Coast Guard or on sea, the Royal Navy or the Marines. And then a short conclusion, just kind of assess how did the Crown Forces cope and how did they do? Did they succeed or not succeed in this period from 1919 to 21? The War of Independence remained essentially a guerrilla war that we saw throughout the 20th century. But the important thing to realize about the Irish War of Independence is that it's one of the few to succeed. Most wars of independence fail. They're going up against government forces who have huge resources. So 75% of wars of independence in the 20th century have failed. And it was an expensive war. It was costing £20 million a year and saw destructions of parts of Cork, Balbriggan and Trim, atrocities and murders, of course. There were no attacks like we saw in World War I with planes and artillery, but these were used for reconnaissance, and tanks were also used in Dublin as a psychological weapon to intimidate the citizens of Dublin. So it's very much a close quarter war where the use of weapons was at the hand or by hand, excuse me, and mainly pistols and shotguns. And from April 1916 to December 1921, we now know through recent research that 2,850 people died due to conflict in this period. And if we include the 1916 rising, Dublin alone had 835 dead. But if we just look at this period that we're looking at the moment, it would be 360 people were killed, which kind of to compare to the rest of the country, you can see Cork, which is very much the crucible and center of the rebellion, followed by Antrim, of course, and Tipperary following up behind Cork. So this is Dublin in the 19th century. You can kind of see all the military barracks that were there in Dublin, and they were there still in the 20th century. And in many cases, they were there in most of the 20th century for the Irish Defence Forces. Excuse me. So it's very much a military city, and there was always a heavy presence, military garrison, and the police headquarters, the RIC headquarters in Phoenix Park. When we look at the War of Independence, it doesn't happen in one big bang. It builds up to a very high level of violence. So 1918 to 1919 is very much small scale attacks. Then you start to see larger attacks, and particularly at police stations from January 1920 to October 1920. But it's in the final period that we really see an increase in violence and deaths. You see the establishment of active service units in the cities and flying columns in the countryside. And in particular, this final phase is its most brutal phase. Large numbers of deaths. And you must remember, we look at overall deaths, civilians are the ones who suffer. Well over 900 civilians are killed during the War of Independence. This is a proclamation that was issued by Brigadier General Cummings, and that photograph that you saw on the previous slide was from the Imperial War Museum. And this was an approach that was taken December 1920 by the British Army of taking IRA officers and other leaders and putting them on patrols and on transport when the British Army went out patrolling, which kind of showed you the techniques that the British Army was starting to use. And also they were responding to what was a very violent period of Irish history and to the attacks that they were receiving. When we look at the IRA, they're quite small, about 3,000 active members. And we know that well over 17,000 people received pensions. So quite a small group, but then 83,000 people failed to receive pensions. Really what the pensions were going to were those who were involved with the fighting, but all people's wars rely on a huge cadre of people behind the scenes to move weapons, to provide safe houses, to provide them. So it's not just the people involved at the beginning. Colonel John P. Duggan, who is the historian of the Irish Defence Forces, argues that without standard weaponry, collective training, and concentration of force, it was unlikely that guerrilla warfare, no matter how skillfully waged, could achieve a military victory. But it's important to realize that wars of independence are very much people's wars. There are wars where everybody's involved, all strands of society. It's not just those who are fighting. And that's really what the success was for Michael Collins and for the others in the First Dáil and also within the IRA. Why did things change so drastically? And why did the people fall out with the British? It's very much based around the 1916 Rising. The Rising changed public opinion, in particular the executions policy, which started on the 3rd of May 1916 with the execution of Pearse. It also led to a big change in military tactics of the IRA. In 1916, they took over large sections of the city. You can see them in blue. And you can see again the military barracks that they are very much defending against. So they basically set up to fend Dublin from the British soldiers as they left all those military barracks. And it wasn't a very successful plan. The one area that really did work was a Mount Street Bridge, where the Sherwood Foresters were held up by 17 men of the IRA. And Liz talked about that last night. But in particular, why that ambush worked is because the IRA in this area used a technique called defense in depth. And what this meant, if you look at all the blue houses, that's where the IRA were, the 17 volunteers were hidden. So they're using defense in depth to ambush the soldiers. So when the soldiers take out Lieutenant Malone in house number 1, they still have to fight all the way along that area, and they're being ambushed every step of the way. And the casualty rates are very, very high for the Sherwood Foresters. So what the IRA, in particular Michael Collins, learned from the 1916 Rising was that ambushes and assassinations and quick attacks were the way for small groups of soldiers to carry out against a bigger army. And that's what we were to see in 1919 to 21. This is kind of a photograph taken after the truce in 1921 in the summer. And it kind of shows, kind of many ways a romanticized view of what the IRA were like. All here in this photograph have standard weapons and well equipped, young and fit, and getting ready to participate in a flying column. The reality is, though, for many IRA units, they never had enough equipment. And Brian talked about this in the first lecture. Ernie O'Malley, in his classic book on Another Man's Wounds, kind of lists what was in Tipperary when he was visited there working for GHQ. And you can see a vast range of weapons. These weapons that you see here listed kind of cover a period of from about 1800 to 1921. And you don't win a revolution, as Brian said, by having so many weapons. What the IRA did have was a lot of access to pistols, and this is what was coming in through Dublin Port. In this case, Vinnie Byrne from one of the 12 Apostles, this is his Peter the Painter, which is the nickname given to this gun in Ireland. It's named after a rather famous anarchist who was killed in London in 1907. And this weapon was particularly powerful. It was designed to shoot out to 100 meters, which for such a small weapon is very, very impressive in 1919. Weapons like that are quite common today, but this one was deadly effective at the time. And the stock made it almost into a small machine gun, and the stock also used turn it into a holster. Smuggling weapons was essential around Dublin. This particular French dictionary from 1830 was dropped off the Gresham Hotel by a member of the Cumann Mon, the Women's Auxiliary. And this is how weapons were smuggled around. This small weapon here is a French 6.35 millimeter pistol. And that was then going to be picked up by an IRA volunteer and used in an assassination attempt. And then he would have dropped it off later on to be picked up again. And that's how weapons were moved. And it also adds to kind of the secrecy that a man would go home then and he wouldn't have the weapon on him. The sophistication of the IRA is very much highlighted on Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November 1920. Taking out this mixture of intelligence and staff offices around Dublin was a big shock to the British government. On the left-hand side, you can see a map for the operation of the 117 Berhampton Road in Donnybrook. And this kind of shows you the techniques that the IRA have learned. This is actually a map, a recce map, a reconnaissance map, to show exactly where the local police station was in Donnybrook, routes in to carry out the assassination and routes out for the extraction of the active service unit. So this requires a lot of thought. It's no longer just about grabbing a gun and shooting somebody. This requires a huge amount of planning, what we call in the army staff work to get things to operate it. And it shows by November 1921 or 1920 how sophisticated the IRA had become. The reality, though, for most units in Dublin, but also particularly in the countryside, was the use of shotguns rather than rifles. Rifles were always in short supply. And as Ernie O'Malley recounts here again in an operation in Tipperary, at night, shotguns, close quarters, were just as effective as rifles and pistols. It's kind of calculated that 30% of all killings were carried out by shotguns and about 30% by pistols. Again, coming back to that sophistication with the IRA, they created a general headquarters known as GHQ. This is a romanticized painting, painted well after the War of Independence, but it gives you a list of all the leaders within GHQ and their roles. You can kind of see the sophistication. Seamus O'Donovan was Director of Chemicals. Lee Mellows was Director of Purchases. J.J. O'Connell was the Assistant Chief of Staff and led the training element. And of course, Brian talked about the Thompson machine guns, a number of which came into Dublin in May 1921. These were the first of the Thompson machine guns to come off the assembly line in Connecticut and were operated in Drumcondra in a very successful operation. And again, could have been a big game changer if all the ones they had bought in America had come in by the end of the War of Independence. Training memos were issued to all IRA people to teach them how to use weapons, because the IRA never had enough bullets to fire their weapons, so they couldn't practice. So training memos like this provided the essential techniques of how to use a pistol and a revolver and also the Thompson machine gun. And then Brian and Liz both talked about the making of weapons, in particular grenades. Here you have the Rogers Brothers foundry in Ballybur in County Cavan making the shell casings for grenades. And only 50 meters away was the local RIC station. So quite a brave thing for them to do. And here are samples from the National Museum of the different types of grenades and fuses that we used to make them go off. Just to look at one operation for the 3rd Battalion, in this case it's E Company carrying out an operation Rathmines. And they attacked a lorry of the British Army going into the nearby barracks, Portobello Barracks, now called Cathabaruga Barracks. But just looking at the numbers there, you can see that 22 officers, NCOs, and men of the IRA carry out the operation. They have no shotguns or rifles, they only have revolvers. And there's 4 nominated to be bombers. But they also have cyclists who are canvassing out reconnaissance, and they also have first aid. And the truck is stopped, it's damaged, but also 1 British officer is wounded and 2 civilians are injured. But you can also see that the IRA suffer casualties. So this operation happens very, very quickly, incredibly brave thing to do outside the military barracks. But having only revolvers in an operation like this, the operation only lasted for 3 or 4 minutes. IRA volunteers were injured. And of course, as he says there, 1 later on was arrested. And as 1920 and 21 goes on, these operations, every time they go into an operation, they're losing equipment and they're also losing men, which constrains what the IRA can do when you look at what the Crown forces have and what they can utilize to win the operation. So let's look at some of the Crown forces. The Royal Irish Constabulary, around since 1822, get the term Royal in 1867 in recognition of their service in putting down the Fenian Rebellion of 1867. It's a mixed force, 70% Roman Catholic, but predominantly within the officer corps is Protestant. And just to kind of show you the size of it was in 1919, is just over 9,500 members. So quite a small force to take. You have to remember there's 32 counties. And that had to be increased because many Irishmen decided to resign from the RIC, take early retirement, and it required 10,000 black and tan. These are recruits to fill those numbers out to increase it throughout the War of Independence. And as we kind of see the RSC is kind of an effective force, but even by 1919, it was suffering from poor morale. Pay hadn't increased in about 10 years. Recruitment during World War I meant that everyone was stretched and was kind of getting browned off. You can see kind of Limerick is still a very, very busy county with so many stations. And in Dublin, we know there are 39 RIC stations in the suburbs and counties. They're very much a mobile force, all equipped with bikes, but also for the officers, cars, ponies and traps. But you can see also how well equipped they are. They all have weapons, which is different from the Garda Síochána today. The weapons they had were revolvers, like the Webley revolver at the bottom there, but also Lee Enfield carbines, which were shortened versions of the Lee Enfield rifle. And also these shotguns, 1897 Winchester shotgun, very, very effective in stopping riots. And to help the RIC, an auxiliary unit was created in 1920. An auxiliary unit actually had been created during the land wars, the 1870s. So this kind of concept of creating an auxiliary division to help the police had happened before. The auxiliaries on average were only here for less than 9 months. And at maximum, kind of, again, different historians have different figures, between 2,000 and 2,500 of them were recruited. They're very much equipped like they had been trained as members of the British Army. Most of them were officers of the British Army, but very much disliked by the Irish population, but also by their commander, Brigadier Crozier, who resigned in disgust of their actions around Ireland, because they've been told to go into Ireland and finish off the IRA and carry out murder by the throat, a policy that failed. Interestingly enough, the British Labour Party came over at this time and carried out a series of interviews around Ireland, looking at the destroyed buildings, the creameries and so on. And they estimated that 1% of the auxiliaries were particularly men of bad characters, how they describe them. So 25 psychopaths, if you like. And altogether, 21 companies were created between, and then alphabetized between A and Z. This is what they were looking like this time in April 1921, 100 years ago. Very much well equipped, very distinctive, designed to stand out so that everyone knew who they were and to feel threatened by them. Of course, it's the reprisals is what we remember, the auxiliaries and the black and tans, and for what they did. In this case, auxiliaries destroying Balbriggan and shooting 2 IRA men and other citizens of Balbriggan. And this became very, very commonplace from the autumn of 1920 to the truce. In relation to Q Company, which we've talked about, which was the local unit within the North Wall area, they were based, as we've seen from that wonderful video that Joe and the East Wall History Society have produced, were based in the London North Western Railway Hotel. Lieutenant Thomas Philip Ryan was a London man, but had served in the Navy, sometimes described as a major or as a lieutenant. And it's a very recent unit. It was only just created in March 1921, and very much consisted of people who knew their way around ports. So about 56% of their personnel had a Navy background or understood how to catch out the IRA and the weapons that they were importing. It's important also to remember that they weren't just based in Dublin. They then moved out as April and May went along into other port towns and cities around the country. The other Crown Force element in Dublin was the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So the RIC didn't run the police stations in Dublin. There was the Metropolitan Police, which is based on the London Metropolitan Police. And there was about 1,200 of them, and they were unarmed, and they were based in 24 stations in 7 areas, 7 divisions, which again were numbered from A to G. The G men is a term that we've all come to know. They're known as the G division, described as the government division. They were the political police. They were there to keep an eye, in particular in 1867, on the Fenians, and that was a skill that they had developed over 50 previous years. Very, very impressive group of men. And Michael Collins and his team spent most of 1919 trying to put them out of action. In response from 1920, all these men, their revolvers were taken off them, and they were given automatic pistols that you can see there. And that was very much a response to how often they were being attacked and the fact that they needed increased firepower. Here are some photographs just to kind of give you an idea of the difference between them and the RIC. When we look at the British Army peaked 60,000 soldiers in Ireland in 1921. And they took over a more direct role in trying to suppress the rebellion after Proclamation of martial law from December 1920. And that was a response, of course, to a series of events of that November. Again, the British Labour Party in their commission report recorded that the army didn't like doing this role, but they also felt that training had been neglected, discipline had become lax. So again, like the auxiliaries, by 1921, they had become out of control. It's important to realise that in 1913, there was only 2 divisions in Ireland, so roughly about 24,000 soldiers and officers in Ireland at that time, based in the Curragh camp and in Cork. And here's a map just kind of showing that smaller army. So this is a kind of a civilianized army. It's a small professional army. The 5th Division, as I say, in the Curragh, and the 6th Division in Cork. And then there was also a small brigade of cavalry, the 3rd Cavalry Brigade. The officers that you see there are more well remembered in 1914 for the Curragh Mutiny, when they refused, if in the event of a civil war in Ireland, of moving to the north. But the rest, as you can see, of the units are spread around the country. Their role very much was in ceremony. It was remaining behind the barracks, not too heavily involved in policing. And these photographs here just kind of give you an indication of what they were up to. And in 1913, if you take this from the Irish Times, this is the kind of events that they were involved in. There was a whole social circle that started off with St. Patrick's Ball and then went on into May of events based around Dublin Castle and the local Irish government. For Irish regiments, since 1881, Irish regiments have been recruiting in Ireland's specific areas. In Dublin, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers were based in Naas, in Kildare, and from there they had responsibility for Wicklow, Dublin, and Kildare. So you can see the red dots in this map kind of indicate where the other depots were. So for Tipperary, Clonmel was a depot, for Kilkenny, and for Waterford. The kind of one time that you do see the British Army dragged into policing is in the Howth Landings at Bachelor's Walk Massacre on the 26th of July 1914. Here are the volunteers marching back from Howth with the rifles, the newly acquired Howth rifles, as they become the Mauser rifle. And soldiers come out to meet them at Clontarf. And then on the way back to marching to their barracks, the Royal Barracks in Dublin, get involved in a scuffle with a crowd, and 4 civilians are killed. So as I say, most of their time isn't involved in policing, but it does occur in 1914, just on the cusp of World War I. Jumping forward to 1921, to June 1921, and you can kind of see the scale of the British Army presence in Ireland with 60,000 troops. In Dublin, well over 11,000 troops, but you can also see down in Munster, 20,000 troops alone, now in a very much upgunned 6th Division. Of course, the Ulster has been broken away from Ireland by June, because we now have the Government of Ireland Act, which has created the 6 counties. Looking at Dublin, there's 3 brigades. Divisions are broken into brigades. They're led by a gentleman called Major General Boyd, who's known as the Ranker General. He was actually started off life as a soldier, got promoted in the field during the Boer War, and worked his way up to Major General. In Dublin, the 25th Brigade is covering the north side, and the 24th Brigade, based in the Royal Barracks, is looking after the south side of the city. Fighting parts of the army are very much based around those infantry regiments, and here you can see what a regiment looks like. Normally consists of about 700 soldiers in 4 companies, A Company, B Company, C Company, and D Company. And they're the units that went off to fight in World War I, and they're the units that you find in Dublin at this time. Their equipment is very much what they would have used and fought with throughout World War I. But soldiers are very, very, very well equipped. So when we look at those men at Rathmines, those volunteers shooting with their revolvers against the British soldiers, on average, a British soldier leaving a barracks would have had his rifle and 150 rounds of ammunition. So very much the IRA were going up a very well-equipped force. In many cases, every 40 soldiers would have had 2 machine guns to cover them also. Although the loose machine gun has a delightful trick that it does jam a lot. It's quite hard to use anytime I've used it. Again, when we think about British Army, we think everyone is in an infantry unit. Here's the 25th Brigade. You can see the 4 battalions that were making up the fighting element of the 25th Brigade. But looking at the rest of the division in Dublin, you can see all the other units that a unit would have had. Sorry, our dog is by. You can see all the other units that a regiment or a division would have had in Dublin. So you have got Royal Field Artillery, the Royal Garrison Artillery, engineers. You've got at the bottom, you've got the vets. All number of horses, huge number of horses, so vets had to be there. You have the Royal Army Medical Corps based at King George V Hospital, which is still there, used by the Defence Forces as St. Bricken's Hospital. And you can see a large number of signallers and work companies. All these people were not involved in fighting the IRA, but they were there to support the units on the left-hand side of the slide. And we get this information because the division that was based here wrote what they call a divisional history. All the divisions in Ireland have produced divisional histories of what happened when they were here. They're slightly biased. They tell a story from their point of view, and you have to kind of analyze them and be careful of some of their assessments for what they are. And this was published about 10 years ago by William Sheen, where he produced the full account, which if you can, it's still available on Amazon. It's a very, very good read. I'm not going to read out all of these, but it just kind of gives you an indication of some of the elements. When we look at civilians of the army really, this division really gets involved in Dublin from January 1920. They started to carry out raids, cordons around Dublin, as Liz mentioned last week. Curfews, as Liz mentioned, also start off on the 23rd of February and are rolling the whole way up to the summer of 1921. Sometimes it's a curfew of 4 hours at night. Other times it's 6 or 7 hours, which has a big impact on anyone who's in particular in relation to dockers in the port who need to leave their houses early to get down to the docks. They can't. They have to wait for curfew to end. And particularly the main one to point out at the bottom is the proclamation that's issued in Dublin on the 12th of May 1921. Civilians, when warned to halt, if called on to do so, will be liable to be shot if they fail to stop. So that's how violent the city has become 100 years ago. Talbot Street, that image that I start off my talk is the recovery of Sean Tracy's body after his shooting at Talbot Street. And this is their account for the regimental histories. It identifies that 1 officer and 20 soldiers from the Lancashire Fusiliers were sent there, and that Tracy jumped out from the shop to draw the fire of the soldiers. We also know that intelligence officers, including Lieutenant Price, was there, and he was also shot during this occasion by Tracy. In relation to the dockers strike, you can see that straight away, once the dockers strike starts in the summer of 1920, that the military are fully involved and helping the London North Western Railway Company to assist them. This is criticisms within their history of the British government, and you see this a lot, particularly in British Army accounts of their participation in counterinsurgency operations from 1920s right up to the present day. They blame the politicians. In this case, the release of the hunger strikers on the 14th of April 1920 they felt was an appalling decision by the politicians, because it released some of the best IRA men back into the city. And straight away you see an increase in attacks through the summer of 1920 because they're back in operation. And then the transfer of intelligence, the intelligence units within the army to the police in light of Bloody Sunday, they felt delayed and delayed their operations after that. We're starting to see armoured cars and tanks and to be used in Dublin. And in all the divisional histories that the British Army published on their time here in Ireland at this time, they are all big supporters of having more and more of these vehicles. At the same time, by December 1920, there were only 2 Rolls-Royce and 5 Peerless armoured cars in Dublin. So they're not huge numbers of them around. This is an American Peerless armoured car with 2 Hotchkins machine guns, which become more and more common around the city. And in one case, the IRA steal one and try to use it to break into Mount Joy prison. There's a problem with armoured vehicles. In this case, they break down. And you may have heard the Crosley tender, which is one of the many vehicles that they used. Vehicles like that were very delicate. They're not like cars today. Potholes in the city could break the axle of one of those cars. And that's without putting armour on top. So they were very prone to breaking down. But when used by the British Army, were very, very effective. And tanks were also used in around Dublin. And there were 4 mail tanks in this case, as you can see, and they were used in around Mount Joy at public occasions and PR events. They're seen to use for ramming into buildings, but not very, very effective. And they're designed for one thing, which is fight on the battlefield. And also there was a bigger problem that most of the barracks in Dublin have very small gates, which were designed in the 19th century and not for big steel machines like this. This is just a list at the end of one of the appendix of this book that kind of lists out what they lost, the British Army units. And you can kind of just see there again that, you know, equipment was lost, trucks were destroyed. And that's what the IRA were trying to do. They were attacking patrols, but particularly vehicles. And you can see here a searchlight being used on Kildare Street just beside the Dole, and armoured cars in the background. We have to remember Dublin is a very dark city at this time. We don't have too much electricity. There is electricity, but street lighting is not present or as prevalent as it is today. So when they went out and parade or on patrols at night and carry out cordons, they had to bring their own searchlights. And the policy was 2 searchlight trucks and 2 armoured cars when they went out. This is what the rebels lost. Again, this is part of the problem that the IRA have, is that they're losing men who are being arrested, being sent to prisons and interned, but they're also losing equipment. And that's why the port and Hughes company of the IRA here are so important to getting material in. And then you can see the arrested and interned elements and killed attempting to escape as 2. I suspect that's a low number. I would say a lot more of those happened than they are saying. Just looking at the RAF in Ireland. The RAF was going through a bad time in 1919, 1920. At the end of the war, there was a kind of rapid wind down of the RAF, very expensive to run. And Sir Trenchard, who's in charge of the RAF, saw his future and the future of the RAF in going out into the empire. A policy of control without occupation, he promised the British Army and the government. So they went out to practice bombings of insurgencies in India, but also particularly in Iraq. And you can see the figures there that the RAF saw its future very much in the rest of the empire, with 19 of their squadrons abroad. There was one squadron then, one wing in Ireland under a group captain, Bonham Carter, Baldonnel, which of course is still used by the Air Corps, but also number 2 squadron, which was at Arranmore. They really had no operational plans in the first part of it. And it was only really in 1921 that they become very, very active in carrying out patrols and getting involved in what the British Army called drives, which are large numbers of soldiers going through the countryside to try to flush out the countryside IRA units. This gives you an idea of how many aerodromes were in Ireland during the War of Independence. A lot of them were built in 1917 in response to the submarine campaign that the Germans were carrying out, so more and more planes and airships were needed. This gives you an idea in December 1920 of where the RAF was based around in Ireland. The most common plane that they had was the Bristol Fighter, which was a 2-seater plane. which had a spotter observer in the back and then a pilot at the front, and was very, very well equipped. However, the IRA weren't, or the RAF were not allowed to fire indiscriminately in Ireland. There was very, very strict rules in when they could carry on engagements. Although these did start to lessen in May 1921. And just at the bottom there, you can see the high number of deaths, and none of those are due to combat. They're just the dangerous nature of the planes that they're using. They crashed a lot. There was a lot of accidents, including when 3 planes were being flown from Chester in England over the Irish Sea and just simply disappeared with 3 pilots and 3 planes. The planes were never found. Just coming to a conclusion then, to kind of give you an overview of the Crown forces and their participation. It was disappointing military performance from the Crown forces, with 60,000 soldiers, 17,000 RIC men, and an extra 2,000 auxiliaries. They didn't respond very, very well. And that many came from their political masters. There was no clear definition of a role and powers, and they were responding in many ways to what the IRA were doing. And in particular, there was no control over the police force. The auxiliaries and the black and tans were out of control by January 1921, empowered, overpaid, and carrying out atrocities and reprisals all over the place. And there was no unified command of security forces, which meant the army did its thing, the police did its thing, and then within the police, you had the black and tans and the auxiliaries. So there was no joined up thinking going on. The IRA succeeded in breaking down the legal and administrative system in Ireland. And that's essential if you're going to win a rebellion. It's not just about killing soldiers and killing policemen. The IRA set up a counter government, and people start to pay taxes to that government. They also start to go to Republican courts. And that is how you win a rebellion, is when people stop going to the government to solve their problems. And the IRA was very, very good at that. It also showed that society, all classes, all professions, all educations were there involved. So in Dublin, you're seeing university students like Kevin Barry fighting with dockers against the British. And for a successful rebellion, you need all parts of society to coalesce. It can't just come from one class or group. And the British government had lost the support of the Irish public. It did this with the execution policy in May 1916. And that changed Ireland forever. It changed public opinion forever. The trust was gone. And any chance of creating a loyalist group or a group that would side with them was never going to happen by 1920. And overall, there was not enough armoured transport. It came late, and it should have been brought in a lot quicker in 1920. The IRA were picking off policemen throughout 1920 because they were still using bicycles. And in some cases in Tipperary in April 1921, they're still cycling on cycling patrols around Tipperary, which when you look at the high levels of deaths, 158 deaths, majority of them police, is crazy. And within the British Army, as the Labour Commission reported, there was a shortfall in training. You were not getting the best soldiers. They were not getting the best training. And the experienced NCOs, many of them were getting out of the army. They'd just been through a horrific war. And the army had reached a peak in 1918 of 7 million. And people were rushing to get out of it as quickly as possible. And finally, the point has to be made when we look at the Crown forces is that with all guerrilla wars, the Irish did not have to win the war. They made sure about not losing, and it was up to the Crown forces to defeat them, which the Crown forces didn't do. And even when we come to the truce, the IRA were still carrying out operations. They were hemorrhaging men at that stage, but they were still fighting. And there was a surge in May and June of operations. Of course, as Liz talked about last week, the Custom House is probably the most famous of those. So I'm sure what would have happened, there's always the what if the British government decided not to go for a truce. At that stage, the 6 counties had been created. They'd solved what they perceived as the main political problem. And then it was just a truce with the Republican forces. They could have increased and would have had to increase the troops up to about 100,000. And again, increase the police force to maybe up to 30,000 to successfully defeat it. Something that they will tell you in all the British histories of operations in Malaya in the 1950s, that they worked there with those kind of numbers to take out a rebellion. Just looking at some of our future plans in relation to kind of the commemorations. Next year, the 17th of December 1922, next year will be the 100th anniversary of when the British Army did leave Dublin. So on the 17th of December, there's some great newsreel footage of this on YouTube, of seeing the troops marching down from the Royal Barracks, Collins Barracks, down the quays and leaving by ship on the North Wall, but also particularly from the North Wall extension, which is part of the Alexander Basin. And on the image that you see there on the right-hand side is the list of craymen and the overtime they earned in filling up those ships as the British soldiers left. So we'll be doing something for that. And then this autumn, we're working with Landmark and the new theatre companies who have been supported by the Arts Council in creating a new project called the Pump House, the Book of Names, which will look at that history of Dublin, which these talks are really based around. It's about the people of Pearse Street, of North Wall, Ringsend, and East Wall, and their participation in the War of Independence. And it's going to be based in a new area that we created in around the old shipbuilding area, the graving docks, the two graving docks that are there, and the pump houses that remain there, which at the moment we've just restarted building work on this week. This kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the place, but we're very looking forward to working with those theatre companies and putting on an exciting project which will run with the Dublin Theatre Festival in the autumn period. So it's kind of something to look forward to, and we will keep you informed about what we're doing. Just two quick slides just on sources. As I mentioned already, William Sheehan's book, Fighting for Dublin, talks about the British division here and their role in particular. It's a fascinating book, and William fills out a lot of the narrative to kind of flush it out. If you're looking for a very condensed but very well written book, Michael Hopkinson's The Irish War of Independence, which came out 10 years ago, is brilliant. His Civil War book from almost 40 years ago is even better. And Paul O'Brien's book, Havoc, which looks at the auxiliaries and in particular the attack on the hotel, is well written, like all his books. But if you're not into buying books, I would highly recommend the Military Archives website. If you go into the pensions section, you can read huge numbers of accounts of what happened in Dublin. You can also find brigade activity reports for Dublin, looking at the Dublin Brigade and the operations, in particular that period from January to June 1921, but it was very, very busy. Also, a researcher in Britain has established a website called thecairogang.com, which also has huge amounts of details on Bloody Sunday, but in particular on all the auxiliary units in Ireland, which are fascinating. And a lot of biographical details about the officers involved and what happened to them. There's a bit fascinating one about Lieutenant Ryan, who's the commander of Q Company in the hotel. And if you have loads of money and time, I would highly recommend these books. W.H. Coate is a historian from America, and he's written a number of books on the Irish War of Independence, but particularly I like Ambushes and Armour. Ewan Halpin and Daya Cron have just published Dead of the Irish Revolution, quite an expensive book, but if you want to look into all the details of what happened between 1916 and 21 and the number of people who died in Ireland, there is a pen picture of each one of those in that book. And the Military History Society publish a journal called The Irish Sword, and have done a large number of articles on the War of Independence over the last 15 years, which I'd highly recommend. Some fascinating stuff, and you'll find a lot of those details on their website. And finally, the biggest book you can get, and quite a very large book, is the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, published by UCC, which covers every aspect in incredible detail, very well illustrated, and some amazing maps explaining all the events of the War of Independence. So hopefully I came in there at about 40 minutes. I hope I didn't take too much time. I'd just like to thank some of my colleagues for their help in putting this together, in particular Jim and Marta Lopez, but also my previous colleagues at the National Museum and National Library for all their help. So thank you very much for listening. There are my contact details if you have any specific questions, and I would encourage you to go to our website, Dublin Port Archive, which we're regularly updating with news, events, and we're adding more and more material from our collections. So thank you very much.
Love it, Lar. I always give the speakers a bit of a round of applause afterwards. It seems like all the participants, everybody on the line loved it as well. We got the questions rolling in here for you. Are you ready?
Yeah, thanks, man.
Perfect. So Donald, sorry if let me know how I'm pronouncing that. It says, brilliant presentation as ever, Lar. Thank you. With the impossible vision of hindsight, do you think the IRA had the resources to continue its military campaign and win in the event that the treaty had been rejected?
That's a very, very good question. And it is the classic, what if. When I looked at it kind of for this lecture, kind of looking at the way the British Army had run their operation, I kind of realized that it wasn't as good as people talk about it to say. It really did run a poor operation. But the IRA were very, very stretched by July 1921. I mean, 3,500 men were interned at that stage. Michael Collins said they had about 3 weeks of ammunition and weapons to carry on the fight. And so I think they were stretched at that stage. Now, the truce did last, until Christmas, and then we have the treaty debates, and the treaty is signed. And the IRA grew in numbers. They grew in quality, they grew in equipment, and in particular in training. So it was going to be a different IRA if the truce had broken down, and the treaty had been fully rejected by everyone. But at the same time, the British Army was doing the same thing. That's why they're writing these histories. When they write histories in the army, what they're trying to do is it's lessons learned, how we can improve ourselves, which make fascinating reading for historians 100 years later. But they're really, documents designed for the present when they're there. So I'm still not fully sure to answer your question. I think it would have got very, very, very violent, eventually it really came down to how much the British government were willing to take over the country militarily and break the people. And that's why most wars of independence fail, is if the government forces decide to basically crush it, and that means crushing all aspects. It's not just militarily. They have the power and the quality. But you always have to remember with the Irish War of Independence is that the world are looking on, in particular the large Irish communities in England, but also in America. So the world was looking on, and how England responded to that. And they were very sensitive to that international commentary.
Great feedback. Thank you for that. Got a couple more questions. From Timothy, thanks for your presentation, Lar. Did the centralization of intelligence under the police, Ormond Winter, ? Contribute to the relative successes of the Crown forces in Dublin late in the war?
It does late in the war, but as the history accounts, it kind of messes up things in the beginning of 1921. There's still confusion, so they were getting better in their intelligence systems. At the same time, though, as Liz and Brian discussed, the Dublin Metropolitan Police is heavily infiltrated by the IRA. One of the things I didn't talk about, with the army in particular, had given up on telephones. They assumed that all phones were easy for IRA men to hack into. So more and more you see the use of wireless radios. And that's why there's so many signal companies in Dublin, is because they don't trust the telephone. The British government's telephone system isn't trusted. And the same way the RAF are flying from Dublin down to Fermoy, but also into Tipperary to drop off the mail, because the IRA are attacking every mail train, and these would be quick operations, stop the train, everyone into the mail room, and they were getting amazing intelligence out of it. So the British were improving, but the IRA improving, and no one had that, no one had that moment where they could kind of completely knock out the other side. So Winter was definitely getting better, but I don't know if they still hadn't caught Michael Collins by the time of the truce.
Wow, that's insightful. It kind of leads to this next question here. Are there any details of Crown forces that were killed in the war of 19 to 1923 that have not been found and are still missing today?
Yes, there are a number of missing bodies still. I'm not sure where from Dublin, but again, if you go to Ewan Halpin's and Donny Cron's book, you'll find a lot of those details. In particular, down in Cork and in Tipperary, there have been recoveries of bodies in the last 20 years. Even during the truce period, killings are still happening. So if the war doesn't stop on the 12th of July, people are still being killed, civilians, including soldiers in Cork, out for a drink and a date. 3 of them were taken out during the truce period. So these things are, the war isn't over, and so regrettably, there's the big split over the treaty itself. in December 1921, and that leads to 5 months of confusion and eventually to a civil war in June 1922.
Good to know. Next question here for you. We got 2 more before we wrap up. This one's from Thomas. Did the families of RIC members during the War of Independence continue to live among the communities that they were policing?
No, not by 1921. If you say take Tipperary, which I know very well, most police in Tipperary were black and tans, so they were British recruits. So that those families and that kind of setup in the 19th century was broken by the IRA. What had happened by 1921 is the IRA had forced the RIC to go into their barracks. I was thinking about it, how to describe the RIC. The RIC essentially was a property company with a police force attached. It had barracks everywhere. And in Irish context, when we see a barracks, we think 20, 30 policemen. Most barracks that you see around Ireland, in Tipperary, North and South Tipperary, it's one sergeant and two to three constables in a very big building. So physically, they have huge property, but the police force is quite small at 9,000. And their families are very, very important in that local community. But by 1920, those barracks are being destroyed. But also, the IRA succeed in destroying barracks, but in many cases, barracks are just, they decide from an RIC point of view, they can't defend the barracks and they vacate. And those barracks get burnt down, huge numbers, I think well over 300 barracks get burnt down in April 1920, but they've been vacated by the RIC. So that kind of country community police man that we saw in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, had gone by 1920, and had definitely gone by 1921. And you do also for families when they, from Tipperary, those kind of families went back into the bigger towns like Thurles and Clonmel, you do see boycotting occurring, where again, they're becoming ostracized. And by doing that, they broke the RIC.
That definitely leads into the next question here from Aoife. Do you think the public and international response to the British reaction to the events of 1916 had an impact on how they dealt with the War of Independence?
Yeah, I think the propaganda arm, if you like, of the IRA were brilliant. They would describe themselves as the publicity arm. They produced regular bulletins called the Bulletin, and they documented events from their perspective. They were very, very clever in getting every detail of what was happening in Ireland, and some very good books on that, looking at how the international press, in particular the French, were fascinated by it all. And they really did learn from 1916 the importance of those links. So when you think like James Connolly lived in the States, Tom Clark had lived in the States, there's strong links within the IRB back to America, and they're very much used and understood throughout this period. So no, definitely the internationalization is essential for the success of the War of Independence, and in particular for the IRA at this time.
Lovely. And last one from our very own Lynette. Thank you, Lar, for a great lecture as always. Did any battles or attacks take place within Dublin Port?
Great question. Not the main one that we know of is the one on the hotel. But last night I was looking at the brigade activity reports, and there are raids for arms into the port. I haven't come across any attacks in those brigade reports. So brigade reports were produced in the 1930s and 40s, listing all the operations that the local units were involved in. But I'll be going through them again to double check them, because it definitely is attacks occurring more so than I thought in or around where the port is today. So the answer to that one is, I don't have a full answer yet, but I will have one by the weekend.